We have talked a lot about the impressions that the Beatles had about the songs they did as a band. But with the group split up and their solo careers ahead of them, the press questioned each of the Beatles every chance they got about almost anything related to the group. And thanks to that, more than once they had to talk about the solo work of their former bandmates. So in today's video, we'll review some statements left by John, Paul, George, and Ringo about the solo work of the other members of the Beatles. By the early spring months of 1980, John Lennon had begun to recapture his lost muse after more than 4 years in self-imposed retirement. And one afternoon while listening to the radio in his car, he randomly heard, "Coming Up." "Fuck a pig, it's Paul," he exclaimed. McCartney's latest single, to Lennon's ears it was simply infectious. In fact, although he had tended to dismiss much of Paul's recent work as bubblegum pop, this new tune had truly captured his attention. Lennon couldn't get "Coming Up" out of his head. "It's driving me crazy," he said, as he experienced the disconcerting return of the old competitive energies of his rivalry with McCartney. "I thought that 'Coming Up' was great," he remarked later that year, "and I liked the freak version that he made in his barn better than that live Glasgow one. If I'd have been with him, I'd have said, that's the one to do." Lennon was not a big fan of Paul's work, and so "Coming Up" turned out to be a pleasant surprise. By the 1970s, Lennon admitted, "I was so full of me self-centered, I didn't give a shit what he was doing." Besides, said Lennon, Paul was putting so much stuff out that it was difficult to keep up, and sales-wise, forget it, as far as Lennon was concerned. Paul always had more fans than me, even in the cavern, so there's no comparison on that level. As far as artistry goes, said Lennon, it would be like pitting Magritte and Picasso against each other. How can you compare it? London Town was released as a single in the US on August 21, 1978, with "I'm Carrying" on the B-side. It reached number 39 on the Billboard Hot 100, and George Harrison singled out "I'm Carrying" for praise during a 1979 interview. "I've always preferred Paul's good melodies to his screaming rock and roll tunes. The tune I thought was sensational on the London Town album was 'I'm Carrying,' but all the noisy, beaty things I'm not into at all. But then, that's not only with Paul's music, that goes right across the board. I'm not a fan of that sort of punky, heavy, tinny stuff. I like a nice melody." In 1982, Paul appeared on the BBC radio series Desert Island Discs, where celebrities pick 8 records they'd take to a desert island. Paul didn't pick a Beatles record, but he said that he'd take "Beautiful Boy" by John Lennon to sort of sum up the whole Beatles experience.
It's very moving to me. Anyway, so I'd just like to sum the whole thing up by playing a song called "Beautiful Boy." Beautiful, 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 beautiful boy.
Nearly 40 years after that show, Paul was asked again about his favorite John Lennon solo song, to which he replied, "Obviously Imagine and Instant Karma is great. And the nice thing was, when I listened to the records, I can imagine him in the studio and go, oh, okay, I know what he's done. I'm often asked for my favorite tunes kind of thing, and I always include Beautiful Boy." In fact, in 1984, Paul thought about covering it for the soundtrack of his movie Broad Street, and Harrison did give his opinion on it.
He said that he wanted to tackle some of the other old songs, including possibly some of John Lennon's songs, like Beautiful Boy and Imagine. Does that surprise you that he would do that?
Paul?
Yeah.
Maybe because he ran out of good ones of his own.
Well, now we've got that on record.
Well, it's true.
Band on the Run became a huge hit for Wings. The album reached number 1 on the Billboard 200 for 4 weeks, remaining on the chart for 120 weeks in total. About the album, John Lennon said it was a great album, and he said to Rolling Stone magazine in 1975, "Band on the Run is a great album. Wings is almost as conceptual a group as Plastic Ono Band. Plastic Ono was a conceptual group, meaning whoever was playing was the band, and Wings keeps changing all the time. It's conceptual. I mean, they're backup men for Paul. It doesn't matter who's playing. You can call them Wings, but it's Paul McCartney music, and it's good stuff. It's good Paul music, and I don't really see the connection." A lot has been said about All Things Must Pass as Harrison's masterpiece. and his story of how these magnificent songs were rejected by the Beatles makes it even more powerful. But about the album and Harrison's success in 1970, Lennon said, "George has not done his best work yet. His talents have developed over the years, and he was working with two fucking brilliant songwriters, and he learned a lot from us. You know, and I wouldn't have minded being George, the Invisible Man, and learning what he learned. And maybe it was hard sometimes for him because Paul and I are such egomaniacs, but that's the game." George was then asked, "Did you get any comments from John or Ringo or anyone saying congratulations?" To which George replied, "I remember John was really negative at the time, but I was away and he came round to my house and there was a friend of mine living there who was a friend of John's. He saw the album cover and said, 'He must be fucking mad putting 3 records out. And look at the picture on the front. He looks like an asthmatic Leon Russell.' There was a lot of negativity going down." In the Lennon Remembers interview of 1970, John said that All Things Must Pass was better than McCartney, but not something I'd listen to. Paul has never said much, except that he heard it at the time, but nothing more. And Ringo, finally in 1971, listed All Things Must Pass as brilliant and praised George's work.
Well, you know, it's just such a classic of John's. It was after we split up, so I wasn't with him when he wrote it. But it's just one of those songs when you hear it for the first time, you know it's a killer. And I still love looking at footage of him singing it.
During an interview with Rolling Stone in 1990, Paul talked about how the press was pushing him to sing Imagine at his concerts, to which Paul responded, "People started saying, 'Why don't you sing Imagine?'" he recalled. And I thought, fuck, Diana Ross sings Imagine. Everybody sings Imagine. About the album, Paul said that he liked it, but that John's previous works were not to his liking because they were too political. The McCartney album, because of the way it came out announcing the end of the Beatles, was slammed by the press and by John Lennon. When talking about the latest album, Lennon wasn't shy about how much he detested McCartney's debut release, telling Rolling Stone, "I thought Paul's was rubbish." Since George Harrison was already riding high off the success of his massive debut album All Things Must Pass, Lennon would also describe McCartney's attempts at a solo career as light and easy. This series of statements by Lennon would end in a public lawsuit that would explode with the release of Ram. George stated he liked Paul's songs like Maybe I'm Amazed and That Would Be Something, but was otherwise pretty dismissive. On Ram, Paul McCartney's second album, Ringo told to the media, "I feel sad about Paul's albums. I don't think there's one tune on the last one, Ram," Ringo Starr told the UK's melody maker at the time, adding that, "I just feel he's wasted his time. He seems to be going strange." This comment by Ringo is probably influenced by the bad relationship they had in 1971. John Lennon hated the album too, dismissing his former songwriting partner's efforts as music to my ears in his song, How Do You Sleep? Early editions of Imagine included a postcard of Lennon pulling the ears of a pig in a parody of Ram's cover photograph of McCartney holding a ram by the horns. However, he said he liked the final part of Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey. But Lennon continued to criticize Paul's records on Wildlife. John said that some things were improving, but others not so much. Give Me Love pushed Paul McCartney and Wings' My Love from the top of the Billboard, marking the only occasion that two former Beatles have held the top 2 chart positions in America. On release, McCartney described it as nice, adding, "The guitar solo is ace and I like the time changes." When asked for his opinion of Walls and Bridges during the press conference for his 1974 North American tour, George Harrison described it as a lovely album. Ringo Starr said he admired all of Lennon's work, apart from Sometime in New York City, and he lauded Walls and Bridges as the finest album in the last 5 years by anybody. McCartney said it was a great record, but added, "I know he can do better." McCartney cited the Beatles' song I Am the Walrus as an example of how Lennon could be more adventurous and more exciting. John, George, Paul, and Ringo continued to make wonderful music after the Beatles, and this video is a sample of how they stayed connected musically. John said somewhere in the early 70s that he thought the work of the 4 former Beatles was better than when they were a group. And although that is a matter of taste, it is clear that the level of music they made as solo artists is also of a very high standard. We also think that at the time of the separation of the Beatles, they were so fed up with everyone that the least they wanted was to praise each other. As time goes by, it was much easier to recognize the other. And that's all for today. Comment below what other albums you would like to see in this series. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our videos, and thank you for your time. This is Music Box.